Christina.
Hey, Susan.
What are we talking about?
We're going to talk about Z-scores.
Oh, I like Z-scores. And
Mhm.
we've because it's another measure of relative standing.
Yep.
And we looked at box plots and the 5-number summary, which is kind of a relative standing based on medians.
Mhm.
This is going to be a relative standing based on means and
Mhm.
standard deviations. Okay.
Yeah. 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 And so the mean, and then also that standard deviation, which tells you kind of how spread out your data is.
Mhm.
Yeah. So a Z-score, sometimes a Z-score is also called a standard score.
Yeah.
Because it's a good way to standardize scores so that you can compare kind of apples and oranges.
Mhm.
Um, because a z-score is the number of standard deviations that a given value is above or below the mean. So a positive z-score means that my value is above the mean or higher than average.
Yes.
And a negative z-score means that my data value is below the mean or below average.
And then a z-score for the mean is 0.
Yes, exactly. The z-score for the mean is 0.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes I want to know. Okay. So if my standard deviation tells me how spread out my data is, and our usual values are within 2 standard deviations, I might want to know kind of how much my data value is above or below the mean.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first example here is kind of goes back to that comparing apples and oranges.
I like this example.
Yeah. So Alice took the ACT and Bob took the SAT. So how can I compare their scores? I can find Z-scores for them, standard scores.
And that way we can compare their z-scores, because it's very difficult to compare an ACT score to an SAT score.
Yeah,
but if we compare their relative standing in the population, then it's easier. It's easier to see what's going on.
So compare the following z-scores. The mean ACT score in the US is 24 with a standard deviation of 4. The mean SAT score is 1100 with a standard deviation of 80. If Alice scores 32 on the ACT and Bob scores 1200 on the SAT, which has a better score relative to the sample data? So for Alice's z-score, I want to use the mean and the standard deviation for the ACT scores, which is 24 and 4. Okay. Her score is a 32. So if I use that z-score formula, the x value, 32, minus the mean of 24, divide by the standard deviation, then I would get 2. So Alice's z-score is 2.
And what does that mean? I think it tells us a couple of pieces of information. The fact that it's positive tells us something, and then the actual value tells us something. So,
yep. So since it's positive, I know that it is above the mean, right?
So Alice is above average.
And it's a 2. So that means that her score is 2 standard deviations above the mean. So right on the cusp there of being unusually good.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, what does the z-score mean in words? Again, Alice's ACT score of 32 is 2 standard deviations above the population mean of 24. Okay. So that calculation right there, that's how you calculate the z-score. This is not something that you can find in StatCrunch. You do need to use this, z-score formula.
Yes.
To calculate that. Yeah.
Good point.
Okay. So Bob's SAT score, was a 1200.
Yes.
But the mean and the standard deviation are different for Bob, right?
Right.
So the
He's
mean
still
is
above average. I can see that already. He's still above the mean because the mean is 1100.
Yep. And so when I do the z-score calculation, you get 1.25. 1200 minus 1100 divided by 80 equals 1.25. So Bob's SAT score of 1200 is 1.25 standard deviations above the mean. And so when I look at those z-scores, I can tell that Alice's score is relatively better.
Yes.
Okay, because she's more standard deviations above the mean.
Right. Can we talk just a second about if you got a negative z-score, how you would word that? Because let's say we got a negative z-score of let's say we got a z-score of negative 1.2. Okay.
Mhm.
Then if we had a z-score, look at you typing. If z-score is negative 1.2, then we would say that x value is 1.2 standard deviations below the mean. That's how you calculate that negative information, is to say below the mean. You don't say that it is negative 1.2 standard deviations. You would say it's 1.2 standard deviations below the mean.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Good. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to look at, there's an example here that you should read through. And then the other
And
thing.
try to work. I mean, try to work it and check with the key.
Yes, definitely. What if we want to work the other direction? So if I want to know what X value corresponds to a specific Z-score,
Okay.
I can also find that. Okay. So you can use the Z-score formula and like put in the value you have for Z and solve it for X. But I actually like doing it the way I wrote it out here a little better.
Which is just all you did was just really take the z-score formula and algebraically manipulate it to solve for x, so that you have, instead of z equals, you have x equals, and you have an equation.
Yeah, because so this says the mean study time in a week for college students is 185 minutes with a standard deviation of 15 minutes. What study time X corresponds to a z-score of 1.4? So if z equals 1.4, then X is 1.4 standard deviations above the mean.
Mhm.
So I know that I'm going to take my mean, 185, and I'm going to add 1.4 standard deviations to it. So that's what we did here. We took 185 plus 1.4 times the standard deviation.
Of 15.
And that gives me 206.
Yep.
So a study time of 206 minutes corresponds to a z-score of 1.4.
Okay, let's look at having a negative z-score.
Okay. So, let me move this down the next page. Okay. So what study time corresponds to a z-score of negative 2.5? Somebody studying below the average.
Oh, you don't want that to be you.
No.
Not for the test.
No. So 2.5 standard deviations below the mean, I'm going to subtract from my mean, 185 minus 2.5 times the standard deviation of 15.
Yep.
And get 147.5.
That's it.
Yep. Good. And then, there's a lot of practice in the homework on finding z-scores. And then also some of these where if you have a z-score, what's the X value that corresponds to that? So just let us know if you have any questions.
All right.